14-5, Harlem, New York. In what law enforcement authorities are describing as the most audacious announcement of criminal conflict in the history of New York City, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, the infamous 7-year-old crime boss who oversees a substantial portion of Harlem's profitable numbers gambling enterprises, has announced all-out warfare against Arthur Dutch Schultz, Fliegenheimer, and his criminal syndicate in a confrontation that has already resulted in 6 deaths within the initial 24-hour period. And this threatens to turn Harlem's avenues into a war zone where ordinary residents could find themselves in the line of fire between competing gangs battling for dominance of unlawful gambling ventures valued at roughly $20 million each year. The startling war declaration occurred at around 2:30 p.m. yesterday afternoon, Thursday, September 15th, when Bumpy Johnson, accompanied by more than 24 armed colleagues, entered the Renaissance Ballroom on West 138th Street, where Dutch Schultz was conducting a gathering with his senior operatives. And before nearly 100 onlookers, including multiple off-duty law enforcement officers who were present at the venue, Johnson walked up to Schultz's table and issued what observers characterize as a demand that allowed for no confusion. You've got 48 hours to remove every single one of your people from Harlem. Take your vehicles, take your money collectors, take your muscle, and leave. This is the sole warning you're going to receive. After 48 hours, any white man we discover operating numbers in Harlem is a corpse. I don't care if you're Dutch Schultz or if you're the President of the United States. Harlem belongs to Harlem, and we're reclaiming it. Based on numerous eyewitnesses questioned by this publication, Dutch Schultz, a 30-year-old bootlegger and racket operator who has been forcing his way into Harlem's numbers operations over the previous 18 months, at first laughed at Johnson's announcement, seemingly believing it was an empty bluff from a crime figure whose enterprise Schultz had been methodically dismantling through brutality and threats. But Johnson's reaction to Schultz's laughter proved that this was no hollow warning. Johnson withdrew a .45 caliber handgun from his coat, set it on the table right in front of Schultz, and spoke words that have echoed throughout Harlem's neighborhoods in the time since. You think this is amusing? You think Bumpy Johnson is some nobody you can intimidate? Laugh right now, Dutch, because in 48 hours I'm going to make you weep. Johnson then departed from the Renaissance Ballroom with his companions, leaving Dutch Schultz clearly rattled and leaving observers shocked by what they had witnessed. A direct confrontation between 2 of New York's most dangerous criminal figures. A public defiance that could only be met with bloodshed. A war declaration that would commence within hours. The bloodshed started almost right away following Johnson's demand, proving that his warning was not simple posturing, but was supported by a coordinated military-style campaign that had obviously been organized well before the public announcement. 3:45 p.m., Thursday, September 15th. Leo the Lip Lindemann, a 4-year-old enforcer for Dutch Schultz, who had been tasked with pressuring Harlem numbers operators into surrendering their enterprises to Schultz's syndicate, was shot dead outside a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue. Observers report that 3 colored men walked up to Lindemann as he was getting into his car, that one of the men shouted Lindemann's name, and that when Lindemann spun around, he was shot repeatedly at point-blank range with what seemed to be Thompson submachine guns. The assailants escaped in a black Packard vehicle that was subsequently discovered abandoned in the Bronx, torched beyond identification to eliminate evidence. 5:20 p.m., Thursday. Vincent Clutch Melnick and James Red Sullivan, both money collectors for Schultz's numbers operation, who had been tasked with gathering betting slips and cash from Harlem runners, were ambushed on West 145th Street. Based on police accounts, the 2 men were seated in their automobile tallying the day's receipts when a truck pulled up beside them, and no fewer than 4 gunmen unleashed fire with automatic weapons, killing both men on the spot and obliterating the vehicle. Police calculate that more than 100 rounds were discharged in the assault, which happened in full daylight on a street where numerous civilians were around, though remarkably no passers-by were harmed. 8:30 p.m., Thursday. Michael Mickey Russo, 28, who ran one of Schultz's policy banks, where wagers were logged and winnings were determined, was killed when an explosive device detonated at his residence in the Bronx. Police examiners suspect the bomb was positioned beneath Russo's car and was triggered remotely as Russo neared his automobile. The blast was so intense that it broke windows in structures on the opposite side of the street and formed a hole in the roadway where Russo's vehicle had been stationed. 11:45 p.m. Thursday. Anthony Little, Tony Benedetto, and Joseph Joey Numbers Catalano, both middle-tier supervisors in Schultz's Harlem enterprise, were murdered when shooters stormed into a restaurant in East Harlem where the two men were eating a late meal. Observers report that 5 colored men came into the restaurant, proceeded straight to Benedetto and Catalano's table, and discharged weapons without notice, murdering both men and injuring a server who tried to step in. 2:15 a.m., Friday, September 16th. Harold Bunny Weinstein, one of Schultz's chief lieutenants, who had been managing the comprehensive operation in Harlem, was murdered when his secured apartment on the Upper West Side was stormed by what police characterize as a small militia of roughly 15 to 20 men who employed explosives to break through the apartment entrance and then murdered Weinstein and 2 guards who were inside the residence. By daybreak on Friday morning, fewer than 12 hours following Bumpy Johnson's public demand, 6 of Dutch Schultz's operatives were deceased. His Harlem enterprise was in disarray, and the New York Police Department was activating emergency assets to stop additional bloodshed in what Commissioner Edward P. Mulrooney termed the most perilous gang conflict in the city's chronicle. To comprehend the present crisis, one must comprehend the man who has announced warfare against Dutch Schultz. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known everywhere as Bumpy, owing to a prominent bump on the rear of his skull from a childhood wound, is a person who has been ascending through Harlem's criminal hierarchy for the previous 7 years and who has evolved from small-time numbers runner into what numerous people are now dubbing the Godfather of Harlem. Background: born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Johnson relocated to Harlem with his family in 1919 at age 14, pursuing opportunities that were unavailable to colored families in the segregated South. But instead of seeking lawful work, young Johnson was attracted to the street existence, laboring initially as a runner for Stephanie Street. Claire, the legendary Madam Queen, who constructed Harlem's policy gambling industry into a multi-million-dollar operation. Johnson demonstrated himself to be clever, merciless, and driven. Where other numbers runners merely gathered bets and transported them to policy banks, Johnson examined the enterprise, grasped the mathematics of the numbers racket, recognized the massive profits that were achievable, and schemed his climb to authority. 1925 to 1928, Johnson labored directly for Madam Street Claire, becoming her most reliable enforcer and guardian. Throughout this interval, he acquired a reputation for brutality. Johnson was suspected of murdering at least a dozen men who had attempted to steal from policy operations or who had menaced Madam Street. Claire, though no prosecutions were ever brought owing to absence of witnesses prepared to testify against him. 1928 to 1930. In what remains one of the more enigmatic periods of Johnson's existence, he vanished from Harlem for almost 2 years. Some accounts indicated he had been in Chicago, though the objective of this prolonged absence remains uncertain. When Johnson came back to Harlem in 1930, he had cash, had contacts, and had understanding about criminal enterprise that he hadn't held before departing. 1930 to 1932. Johnson broadened his ventures beyond simple muscle work, acquiring multiple policy banks, merging smaller enterprises, and constructing what analysts calculate is a $5 million per year gambling domain. But perhaps more importantly, Johnson cultivated devotion among Harlem's colored criminals and among the community broadly. He was recognized for shielding policy operators from white gangsters who attempted to force their way in, for hiring hundreds of Harlem citizens in his ventures, and for donating to colored churches and charitable organizations in ways that made him well-liked despite his criminal pursuits. The current crisis. Johnson's climb to authority brought him into direct confrontation with Dutch Schultz, who had been methodically seizing Harlem's policy operations through brutality and coercion. For the previous 18 months, Schultz's operatives had been compelling colored policy operators to surrender their enterprises at prices far beneath their genuine worth, had been murdering operators who declined to surrender, and had been extracting tremendous profits from Harlem while hiring mostly white collectors and muscle rather than recruiting from Harlem's neighborhood. By September 1932, Schultz dominated an estimated 40% of Harlem's policy enterprise, had forced Madam Street, Claire, into semi-retirement, and seemed to be approaching total control of Harlem's most lucrative criminal venture. But Schultz had miscalculated regarding Bumpy Johnson, had regarded him as just another colored gangster who could be frightened or eliminated, had neglected to acknowledge that Johnson had been orchestrating his retaliation for months, and had neglected to grasp that Johnson had backing that extended beyond simple criminal enterprise. Arthur Fliegenheimer, who took on the name Dutch Schultz to conceal his Jewish background and to sound more threatening, is one of New York's most dreaded gangsters. A 30-year-old bootlegger and racket boss whose syndicate is thought to oversee illegal liquor, gambling, and labor extortion operations valued at more than $50 million each year. Background: born in the Bronx in 1902 to German Jewish immigrant parents, Fliegenheimer turned to law-breaking in his adolescence after his father deserted the family and his mother was unable to furnish sufficient support. He took the name Dutch Schultz from a notorious Bronx street crew, thinking the Germanic name would be more frightening than his Jewish family name in the largely Irish and Italian criminal landscape. Criminal empire. Schultz constructed his wealth during Prohibition, dominating beer distribution throughout the Bronx and northern Manhattan, paying off police and politicians on a magnitude that made even other criminals impressed by his corruption network. By 1930, Schultz was one of the richest criminals in America, was residing openly in costly apartments, was eating at the best restaurants, and was functioning with almost total immunity from legal action owing to his widespread corruption of law enforcement. The Harlem expansion. But bootlegging's profitability was endangered by mounting demands for Prohibition's reversal, and Schultz understood that he needed to branch out into rackets that would stay illegal after Prohibition concluded. Policy gambling, especially Harlem's advanced numbers operations, represented the ideal chance. Beginning in early 1931, Schultz commenced methodically acquiring Harlem's policy banks through tactics that merged business acumen with vicious violence. Intimidation. Schultz's muscle would visit colored policy operators and propose to purchase their operations at prices that were usually 10 to 20% of genuine value. Operators who declined would be assaulted, would have their policy banks firebombed, would see family members threatened, murdered. Operators who kept resisting following initial intimidation were executed, shot on the avenue, bombed in their residences, assassinated publicly as cautionary tales to others. Police calculate Schultz's syndicate murdered at least 30 colored policy operators throughout the 18-month drive to seize Harlem. Economic warfare. Schultz's enormous resources permitted him to reduce competitors' odds, to distribute larger winnings, to draw customers, to function at a deficit temporarily in order to eliminate competitors who were unable to afford to equal his payouts. By September 1932, Schultz had accomplished considerable success, dominated an estimated 40% of Harlem's policy enterprise, had forced numerous smaller operators into bankruptcy, and seemed to be invincible. But he had committed a critical mistake. He had miscalculated regarding Bumpy Johnson and had neglected to acknowledge that there were boundaries to how much violence Harlem's colored community would accept from white gangsters. As this publication goes to press on Friday evening, September 16th, roughly 27 hours remain until the 48-hour time limit that Bumpy Johnson placed on Dutch Schultz runs out. The anxiety in Harlem is unmistakable. Citizens are remaining indoors, establishments are shutting down early, and police deployment has been augmented to degrees not witnessed since the race riots of 1919. Police response. New York Police Commissioner Edward P. Mulrooney conducted an emergency news conference this morning at police headquarters where he revealed exceptional actions to stop additional bloodshed. The New York Police Department will not permit gang conflict in any community under any conditions. We have stationed more than 500 extra officers to Harlem. We have set up roadblocks on principal streets, and we have instructions to detain anyone irrespective of color or background who is discovered possessing weapons or who is suspected of participation in criminal gang operations. I am urging both sides in this confrontation to cease hostilities, to settle their disputes through legal means, and to understand that persistent violence will result in the complete force of law enforcement being directed against both syndicates. Nevertheless, analysts point out that police attempts to quell gang violence have been mostly unsuccessful in the past, especially when the criminals involved have compromised substantial portions of the police force itself. Numerous sources inside the police department have verified to this publication that both Johnson's and Schultz's syndicates have police officers on their payment rosters, creating circumstances where police reaction to gang violence is frequently postponed or intentionally ineffective. Community reaction. Harlem's colored community seems to be predominantly sympathetic to Bumpy Johnson's position against Dutch Schultz, perceiving the confrontation not merely as a gang conflict, but as a racial battle for dominance of Harlem's economy. The Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Sr., pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church, issued a statement that numerous people understood as indirect backing for Johnson's conduct. While we cannot approve of violence or criminal conduct, we acknowledge that Dutch Schultz and his syndicate have terrorized our neighborhood, have taken millions of dollars in earnings while contributing nothing back to Harlem, and have murdered our people without regret. If Bumpy Johnson is battling to recover Harlem from these external exploiters, then numerous in our community will regard his conduct as protection rather than as hostility. What happens at 2:30 p.m. Saturday, when the 48-hour time limit runs out tomorrow afternoon? One of three possibilities seems probable. Scenario 1. Schultz withdraws. Dutch Schultz could acknowledge that persisting the battle would be too expensive, could pull out his operations from Harlem, could prevent additional bloodshed by complying with Johnson's demands. Nevertheless, analysts think this is doubtful. Schultz has too much committed in Harlem's policy operations, has too much arrogance to be publicly embarrassed by a colored gangster, and has assets that surpass Johnson's syndicate. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. Delegates from both sides could bargain a compromise that permits both syndicates to function in Harlem with specified territories and mutually agreed boundaries. Nevertheless, given the bloodshed of the previous 24 hours and the public character of Johnson's demand, such bargaining seems unattainable without both sides appearing weak. Scenario 3. All-out war. The most probable possibility is that violence will intensify dramatically following the deadline's expiration, that both sides will try to annihilate each other's syndicates through coordinated strikes, and that Harlem will transform into a war zone where scores or even hundreds of people could be murdered before either side secures victory or before law enforcement succeeds in detaining enough gangsters to terminate the confrontation. The gang conflict in Harlem has captured attention at the uppermost levels of government. Sources in Washington verify that federal authorities are watching the circumstances closely and are ready to step in if local authorities are unable to restore peace. FBI interest. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has supposedly instructed agents from the Bureau's New York field office to commence examining both the Johnson and Schultz syndicates, searching for federal violations that could furnish justification for federal criminal charges. Violations of the Volstead Act, prohibition statutes, interstate transportation of stolen goods, income tax evasion, and other federal violations are being examined. Treasury Department. Federal tax agents are supposedly scrutinizing the financial documentation of both syndicates, searching for proof of income tax evasion that could be utilized to charge key persons. The recent triumphant prosecution of Al Capone for tax evasion has proven that gangsters who are challenging to convict for violent violations can occasionally be imprisoned for neglecting to pay taxes on their unlawful income. The political implications. The Harlem gang conflict arrives at a challenging time politically, with national elections scheduled for November, with President Hoover confronting strong opposition from Franklin D. Roosevelt. And with the nation stuck in the worst economic depression in its chronicle, the display of gangsters openly battling in New York City constitutes an embarrassment to the Hoover administration and furnishes ammunition for detractors who contend that prohibition has generated more difficulties than it has resolved. To grasp why this gang conflict is so fierce, one must grasp the economics of Harlem's policy gambling operations. Based on calculations from law enforcement and from independent analysts, Harlem's numbers racket produces roughly $20 million in gross income yearly, making it one of the most profitable criminal ventures in the United States. How the policy game works. Policy gambling, also termed the numbers or bolita, is a lottery-style game where participants wager small sums, usually 10 cents to $1, on three-digit numbers, hoping to equal the winning number that is selected daily. The winning number is usually derived from published financial data, such as the final three digits of the New York Stock Exchange trading volume, to stop operators from manipulating outcomes. The probability of winning are roughly 1,000 to 1, but distributions are usually 600 to 1, providing operators a considerable profit margin. Furthermore, most participants forfeit their wagers, meaning operators retain the bulk of money wagered. The profit structure. Of the $20 million wagered yearly in Harlem, roughly $2 million is distributed to winners. Roughly $3 million goes to operational expenses, runners, collectors, guards, policy banks. Roughly $2 million goes to payoffs, police, politicians, judges. Roughly $13 million is pure earnings to operators. This $13 million in yearly profit is what Dutch Schultz and Bumpy Johnson are battling for, money that constitutes one of the biggest concentrations of wealth overseen by criminal syndicates anywhere in America. The community impact. The policy racket is thoroughly ingrained in Harlem's economy. Thousands of citizens are hired as runners, collectors, and in other roles within the policy operations. Numerous legitimate establishments, restaurants, barbershops, newsstands, function as gathering points for policy wagers and obtain commissions for this function. Some calculations indicate that as many as 25,000 Harlem citizens obtain at least some of their earnings from policy gambling, making the matter of who oversees these operations deeply significant to the community's economic existence. The hour grows late. Will Saturday bring bloodshed? As Friday evening transforms to night, as Harlem avenues empty of civilians who dread being caught in gunfire, as police set up roadblocks and ready themselves for violence, the matter that hangs over New York City is straightforward and dreadful. Will Saturday bring peaceful settlement, or will it bring a massacre that takes dozens of lives and that turns Harlem into a battlefield? Numerous sources inside both the Johnson and Schultz syndicates have verified to this publication that both sides are readying for combat. Accumulating weapons, stationing gunmen, selecting targets, organizing coordinated strikes that will be initiated if the 48-hour time limit passes without Schultz's retreat from Harlem. Johnson's syndicate has supposedly gathered more than 200 armed men, numerous of them World War veterans who understand how to operate weapons and who have battle experience. They have obtained Thompson submachine guns, have stationed marksmen on rooftops overlooking crucial Schultz sites, and have readied vehicles for swift movement during strikes. Schultz's syndicate, with far superior assets, has supposedly transported in reinforcements from his operations in the Bronx and in New Jersey. Observers report witnessing trucks transporting armed men coming into Harlem. Report witnessing weapons being handed out to Schultz's muscle. report arrangements that indicate Schultz plans to reply to Johnson's demand with crushing force intended to destroy Johnson's syndicate permanently. The stage is prepared for disaster. The time limit nears and New York City holds its breath, waiting to discover whether tomorrow will bring tranquility or will bring bloodshed on a magnitude not witnessed in the city's chronicle. Editor's note: the New York Herald will furnish continuous reporting of this developing crisis. Saturday's edition will feature on the scene reporting from Harlem as events transpire, declarations from law enforcement and political authorities, an examination of the wider consequences of this gang conflict for New York City and for the nation. Readers are encouraged to stay away from the Harlem area until this crisis is settled. As the peril to civilians from possible gunfire and from general disorder is acute, we will refresh our reporting as events require. The gang conflict erupting in Harlem, the display of criminals openly defying each other to lethal combat, the audacious character of violence perpetrated in daylight on public avenues, the clear failure of law enforcement to stop or manage this crisis constitutes the ultimate collapse of the prohibition experiment that commenced 12 years ago with such elevated hopes. When the 18th Amendment was approved in 1919 and when the Volstead Act was executed in 1920, supporters assured that outlawing alcohol would diminish crime, would remove the saloon culture that compromised politics, would generate a more moral and more productive American society. Rather, prohibition has generated the reverse. It has made criminals remarkably wealthy, has compromised law enforcement at every tier, has generated gang syndicates that function with impunity, and has made average residents complicit in law-breaking through their persistent wish to consume alcohol despite its legal ban. The present crisis in Harlem is a direct result of prohibition's collapse. Dutch Schultz gathered the wealth he employs to terrorize Harlem through bootlegging operations that should never have been feasible in a society where law enforcement was capable and uncorrupted. Bumpy Johnson constructed his syndicate on gambling operations that prospered because prohibition had already proven that unpopular statutes could be broken with minimal repercussions. The corruption that permits both men to function, the police officers on their payment rosters, the politicians who shield them, the judges who dismiss prosecutions against them, was generated by prohibition's enormous profits and by the impossibility of implementing statutes that millions of Americans break daily. This publication has contended since 1925 that prohibition should be reversed, that the experiment has collapsed, and that the expenses of persisting prohibition in violence, in corruption, in contempt for law broadly surpass any conceivable advantages. The Harlem gang conflict furnishes fresh proof for this contention. We urge political leaders of both parties to admit prohibition's collapse, to labor toward reversal of the 18th Amendment, and to acknowledge that the bloodshed we are observing in Harlem, bloodshed that could take dozens of lives in the approaching days, is a direct result of a policy that has demonstrated to be catastrophic for American society. The Herald has discovered from sources inside the police department that extra violence happened within the previous 2 hours. 3 men thought to be linked with Dutch Schultz's syndicate were murdered in a shooting on Lenox Avenue at roughly 9:30 p.m. Observers report that a vehicle containing 4 colored men proceeded slowly past a cluster of white men who were positioned outside a speakeasy, that one of the colored men yelled, "This is Bumpy's territory," and that shooting commenced right away thereafter. Police arriving at the location discovered 3 deceased men and 2 injured men, all of whom are thought to be Schultz muscle, who had been positioned in Harlem to safeguard Schultz's policy operations. The assailants escaped before police arrived. This brings the complete death count to 9 men murdered in gang conflict since Bumpy Johnson's demand was issued yesterday afternoon, a rate of bloodshed that police say is unparalleled in New York City Chronicle. Commissioner Mulrooney has revealed that a citywide curfew for Harlem will be enacted starting at midnight tonight and persisting until additional notice. All venues in Harlem are instructed to shut down by midnight. All citizens are cautioned to stay indoors, and anyone discovered on Harlem avenues after midnight without valid business will be liable to detention. The Herald will furnish extra updates as this crisis advances. As midnight passes and Saturday commences, as September 17th, 1932 dawns on a city in crisis, fewer than 16 hours remain until Bumpy Johnson's 48-hour demand runs out at 2:30 p.m. Saturday afternoon. The matter confronting New York, the matter that will be resolved within 16 hours, is whether Dutch Schultz will retreat, will pull out from Harlem to prevent additional bloodshed, will recognize that Bumpy Johnson has proven adequate power and adequate determination to make persistent confrontation too expensive, or whether Dutch Schultz will stand firm, will reply to Johnson's demand with crushing force, intended to destroy the upstart who dared to defy him, will turn Harlem into a killing ground where the matter of who oversees Harlem's policy operations will be determined, through bloodshed that could take dozens of lives before one side secures victory. The resolution will arrive tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 p.m. New York holds its breath, Harlem readies for combat, and history waits to document whether September 17th, 1932 will be recalled as the day when a colored gangster triumphantly defied white organized crime's control of Harlem, or whether it will be recalled as the day when crushing force destroyed a rebellion and proved that defying established authority, irrespective of the righteousness of the cause, leads only to death and defeat. The Herald will document Saturday's events as they transpire,